Okay, we're back. I wanted to pick up where we left off, talking about the Panic of 1873. I had told you that the Panic of 1873 was an economic depression, many times called the Long Depression or the Great Depression. The reason we don't call that anymore is because of the Depression of the 1930s, where they took that title. It lasted from at least 1873 to 1879 in the U.S., and many of its effects were felt into the 1880s. For Europe, in fact, it lasted into the late 1890s in certain countries, for example, Great Britain. It was based on speculation in railroad industries and in banks. This is not unlike what we see today with the housing bubble, where things were speculation about the housing market and the value of homes, and it was really inflated, and it was based on speculation, so people got turned upside down in their homes. It's a similar phenomenon here, and the immediate cause in the U.S. was actually because of a guy named Jay Cooke, and he owned a railroad company that went under, and because his railroad company went under, then it caused his bank to fall, and then that triggered a domino effect. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about 4 court cases that you'll need to be familiar with. The slaughterhouse cases were a series of cases where ultimately they were put together and presented to the Supreme Court. And the slaughterhouse cases was the first real test of the 14th Amendment. It's the first time the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment. It was a bit of a setback in terms of civil rights, because they, in ruling this, actually took away some of the protections of African American rights that had been guaranteed by Congress. What happened in this case, long story short, is that there were a series of laws that had been passed in Louisiana where butchers had petitioned the state claiming that they had a right to equality before the law, and these were African American butchers, and so they said that their amendments had been violated. The justices ultimately rejected this claim and said that the amendment had not changed traditional federalism, and that if these were laws that were not directly related or covered under the 14th Amendment, then it was still up to the states to decide. And so this actually allowed states to continue to make laws that actually decreased the rights of African Americans, but not on their surface. The second one is Bradwell versus Illinois, and this one actually involves gender. This was about a woman named Myra Bradwell who had essentially gone to law school and studied with her husband, and in 1869 she passed the Illinois bar, but then she was refused admission to practice law in Illinois because of her gender. She sued and made it to the Supreme Court, and she argued that she should be able to practice law because of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And she claimed that it prevented the state from imposing admission requirements based on gender. Again, the court is going to strike this down in a blow for civil rights, in this case for women, and said that it was a states' rights issue. And one of the justices, Justice Joseph Bradley, actually had the following quote: "It is the paramount destiny and mission of women to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator." So you can see still women have a long way to go convincing people that they are capable of equal participation in the public sphere. U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1876 is yet another blow to civil rights, as the Supreme Court severely restricted Congress's ability to enforce the Ku Klux Klan Act, which was a federal act passed by Congress in 1871. And in this case, again, they sided with the states. They said only states, not the U.S. government, had the right to prosecute Klansmen under the law. So essentially they're saying that the federal government had a limited reach, and that beyond that states had to prosecute crimes within their state. So because obviously places like Louisiana and Georgia and Mississippi are not going to prosecute Klansmen, then this is going to provide fertile ground for racism in the South without the fear of any real federal consequences. And then finally, the case of U.S. versus Reese. This involved a man named Garner, an African-American man, who was refused the vote because he failed to pay a $1.50 tax. So these are early examples of the black codes and the Jim Crow laws. And the Supreme Court once again upheld the legality of this poll tax, saying that it was a state issue and he was not denied the right to vote based on his race. And it's going to confirm what will become a pretty large set of Jim Crow laws that are going to dictate Southern society for the next 70, 80 years. So if we're looking at then what is the new life that blacks in the South are living, the system that emerges is a system called sharecropping. If you look at this map, you can see that the states that have the most sharecropping are the same states that had the most slaves and the most slave labor and plantation systems before the Civil War. This system is also sometimes called tenant farming or the cropland system. And as I talk a little bit about this, be looking over the chart and get a better feel for what this system actually entails for both the landowner and for the slave crop freedmen. This sharecropping system emerged after President Johnson, pardoned tens of thousands of former landowners and restored their land in the South. So in essence, there either wasn't any land to buy, or in some cases, states did in fact pass laws restricting blacks from buying land. For a time there, many African Americans were tricked into signing contracts that put them on gang labor units, if you will, where they were signed contracts thinking that they were, signing up for some kind of employment, and then instead they were actually chained together and forced to work, although they were paid a bare minimum. This practice ultimately did fade because of the work of the Freedmen Bureau. They were able to intervene when whites were trying to force these former slaves into gang labor. But sharecropping emerged as the compromise, although it wasn't a great compromise and didn't provide a lot of opportunity for most African Americans. It was a system where a slave family or a former slave family was given 20 to 50 acre plots, and they gave 50% or more of their crop to their landowner. They also had to borrow quite a bit for the tools and the seed, and there were extremely high interest rates, as you can see here, 60% to 70%. And what this creates is a system of economic slavery. There's absolutely no way to get ahead in this system, especially considering, even on top of all of this, how tedious farming can be with the weather. One quote that was interesting is a quote by Eric Foner, who said, "Freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich." And that's certainly the case here. During Reconstruction, black political participation does rise quite a bit. If you read this map, you can see that although African Americans are in the minority during Reconstruction, that they are nearly, in many cases, a fifth, sometimes higher. If you look at South Carolina, 2/3 of the voting population. You can see then why many of these southern states, as soon as they could get out of Reconstruction in 1876, passed even more substantial Jim Crow laws to limit the political participation of African Americans, and therefore essentially barring them from government. And government makes decisions about society, so they also did not have any real representation for the protection of their rights. You can see there Tennessee's out of the mix because they were restored early, because they passed the 14th Amendment, but you can read the statistics for all the other states. We've mentioned the Freedmen Bureau quite a bit, but I just wanted to touch on it one more time. The establishment of historically black colleges and universities in the South. there is still an organization that serves these institutions, many times called the HBCU, Historically Black Colleges and Universities. You can look it up online. But the Freedmen's Bureau was central to this effort, and as we've mentioned, it did not necessarily establish colleges, but it helped other organizations to establish colleges, maybe the most formidable being the American Missionary Association. But what you'll find with most African American schools is that the largest backer were many times church denominations, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, and even Episcopalians in some cases. So many were funded by religious organizations. You can see the map there, but some of the ones that I'll point out, Atlanta University, which today is still in Atlanta, but actually split into 3 schools. That includes Clark University as well, Fisk University right here in Nashville, Howard in D.C., and Tuskegee in Alabama. The 14th Amendment was the first amendment to use the word male in the Constitution. And so you do have this line of demarcation about who, at this time, American society believes should be able to participate in government. And so you do have a large number of African Americans who serve in state legislatures and who serve in the U.S. Congress. They were mostly made up of men who were core voters, who were black veterans. But as a whole, and a lot of this is because of education and their past, they were not politically prepared to participate in politics. Registration levels did increase quite a bit during Reconstruction, and the levels of voter registration didn't necessarily decline after Reconstruction. It was just the actual votes that came in. And this is all because the 15th Amendment guaranteed federal voting. And as much as we would like to think this was an altruistic, progressive move by Congress, we know it was mostly, in fact, to preserve a Republican majority. So the 15th Amendment, let's talk a little bit more about that. It was ratified in 1870, and it prohibits the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And Congress has the power to enforce this legislation. The biggest group that's missing here, of course, is women. And many women's rights groups were furious that they were not granted the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Anthony, they both opposed the 15th Amendment, but you had other women's rights activists such as Addie Kelly, not quite as well known, and Lucy Stone, who were okay with it. Their line of thinking was, this is the time to handle the citizenship of people who once were in bondage. We can wait our turn. But overall, most women's rights groups were infuriated by this. And there were a few states, particularly in the West and some territories, who did allow women to vote. Why not women? Why weren't women included? The biggest reason is the same reason why the 15th Amendment was passed. They didn't need women to keep a Republican majority. And so they weren't as central, and were also in their own right a controversial issue about their political participation. The failure of federal enforcement with some of the court cases that I've already mentioned, and also the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was struck down as well by a court case, this is going to continually link the rights of citizenship with race. And you're going to see this all the way back as far as Dred Scott, which was before the Civil War. And although Reconstruction changes all of this, it does not expand federal power to enforce states or to force states to also follow rights or follow provisions that include the enfranchisement of African Americans. The South is still carries the banner of the lost cause. The Klan becomes known as the Invisible Empire of the South because they did so much in secret and behind